Good evening, friends, and shalom, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. I want to go ahead and give some shout outs to those of you who have made yourselves known in the live chat. So, Kevin's Biblical Discussions, Nicholas Proclaimer of Messiah, and Ryan the Presbyterian. Shalom's all around to every single one of you, and thank you very much for being here, as well as anybody else who is here but has not yet made themselves known. I got a convenient little ticker here that tells me how many of you are watching, so I know you're there. Don't worry, you are acknowledged. But at any rate, appreciate you guys for being here. If you are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so, and hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. As you may be able to tell, that has been much more frequent as of late. Our little hiatus is done, so we are going to be posting more consistent content. And to remind you guys, remember, when we have the content to post, we don't post it daily. We don't post the same content weekly. But when we have the content to post, we post our Calvinism videos on Sundays. We post our out-of-house conversations / videos on Mondays, hence today's topic. We post our in-house videos or theology videos on Wednesday, and we do our open rooms on Friday, with, of course, breakfast teas on Saturdays and clips / debates posted on Tuesdays and on Thursdays. Again, we don't post every single day, but when indeed content is posted, those are the days it's going to be on. I also see Doki Doki's here with us. Shalom, and thank you very much for being here. Going to go through the channel housekeeping very briefly, of course. So already had our like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. Remember, if you want to contribute to what we do here, you can do so either by giving super chats or super stickers. By the way, questions asked via a super chat have a guarantee of being answered. Also, it's funny, as soon as I say that, Doki gives us a super sticker. Shalom, and thank you very much for being here again, and appreciate the sticker. You can also give super thanks or channel memberships, and you can give either to our Patreon, subscribing for as much or as little as you like there, or give a one-time donation through our PayPal. Please just make sure you give with trepidation, only if you are actually, confident in the work that we're doing here, that it's edifying for the body and intellectually stimulating and glorifying to God, and etc. Right? You can also purchase my book, 15 Questions for Calvinists Answered. Don't worry, it doesn't have this annoying little band if you get it, because that just tells me that this particular work is not for resale. But when you get it, it won't obviously have that. You can get that if you'd like by going to Amazon. I'll go back and edit this video so that the links are actually in the description below. That's about $9.99 for the digital copy and $19.99 for the physical copy, and I appreciate anybody who's getting that. Also, if you are a member of the Kindle Unlimited thing, which I don't know much about because I'm not, you can actually read it for free. So at that point, you read it, and then it's actually kind of convenient. They give me a certain amount of money. It's like a couple cents, but per page that you've read, which is very cool. But anyways, so those are the ways you can get the book there if you're interested. Again, it's just answering 15 questions for Calvinists. Also, you can follow me on various social media websites. I am on Facebook, Twitter, Gab, Odyssey, Truth Social, and I feel like there's one I'm missing. Oh, yeah, it's Parler. But Parler doesn't exist anymore. So not that one, actually. Oh, and Minds. There is another one, Minds. So you can follow me on any of those. Again, I'll be editing the description to add links to that after the fact. Lastly, want to let you guys know about some debates that we have coming up. So we have a debate on October the 3rd. I believe that is the one that's going to be with Based Theory, or Grayson is also what he's known as. We're going to be debating whether or not the biblical Exodus happened. That's going to be on Standing for Truth's YouTube channel. And again, that's going to be October the 3rd at 10 p.m. Mountain Time. Excuse me, way wrong. Sorry. 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I was wrong on two fronts. 8 p.m. Eastern Time. My apologies. Also, a couple days after that, so far we have tentatively rescheduled the debate with Idol Killer / Warren McGrew on October the 9th. So we're going to be debating whether or not there is biblical evidence for total depravity. We were supposed to debate that about a month ago. Things happen. Stuff has to be rescheduled. It is tentatively scheduled now for October the 9th. So we'll see whether or not that ends up happening. It's not been set in stone, but the debate itself, all of us have agreed. And so, Lord willing, it will definitely be happening. I see Sola Scriptura has also joined us, as well as Study is Key. And thank you very much, brother. He says, just so you know, I'm thinking about recording a video interacting with your recent John 12:32 video. Awesome. Awesome. If you do that, let me know. I'll definitely check that out. And I may even interact with it myself. Who knows, right? Anyways, that's all the channel housekeeping we have. Obviously, be on the lookout for future podcast episodes, clips, debates coming up, breakfast tea, all that kind of stuff. If you do fancy, you should fancy. But other than that, that's all the announcement we got. So let's go ahead and say a brief prayer, and then we will get into our video. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you once again for the opportunity to make these videos, Lord Jesus, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with honest interlocutors who are interested in constructive dialogue, even if they are not on the same side, so to speak. I pray that you bless this video so that it is edifying to your body, Lord Jesus, and that it is glorifying to your name. And I pray that you give us all an anointing that we may be able to properly perceive that which is truth here today. And I ask these things in Jesus Christ's name, and we give you the glory. Amen. All right, you're going to go ahead and invite a guest in. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have a guest that some of you may be used to seeing. How's it going, my friend?
Hey. Long time, friend, long time. I listened to you doing your channel housekeeping, and I heard the name Doki. Is that the Doki Bible Club?
It is.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I've seen them many times on Donnie's channel, Standing for Truth. I haven't been on Donnie's channel in a long time either. I should reach out to him, and didn't we do a couple of debates on his channel?
Yeah, a while ago, though. Actually,
it was forever. Yeah. Make me feel even older than I am. Yeah, no. So yeah, it's interesting. Anyway, hey, how are you, Doki? But no, yeah, it's interesting. So I never ever look at the live chat because I have the attention span of a dead squirrel. So if people are, like, yes, there is a chat. I never have it open, so please don't put something in there thinking I might look at it, because I won't, because I just don't see it. But CG, of course, feel free to ask any questions or stuff like that as it comes up, if people want to interact that way. But what I would say just before we get started is to everyone who's watching this live now, and hopefully you've got a packed out room, and to anyone who's going to watch us in the future. So CG and I, we've interacted many times. He's been on our little bitty podcast. I, of course, have been here several times. We've locked horns in debate on other channels. And what you're going to see here tonight, and this isn't prophecy, because I don't think that's a real thing, but just knowing what I know of CJ, we are, and this is something we talked about just before he hit the record button, we're diametrically opposed on almost every issue, pretty much every issue. And what's not going to happen is you're not going to see anybody flipping each other off or dropping F-bombs or being unkind in any way, shape, or form, because that's not what this is about, right? It's not who I am, certainly not who CJ is. And to people who will watch this, I think if, not to put myself up on too much of a pedestal, but if we can all try to have conversations like CJ and I are about to have, just think of how much better communication between our opposing worldviews could be. I'll get down off my soapbox now.
No, I do appreciate it, though, because I think that is it's an important thing, right? Too often we have this back and forth where, one side is doing their best to be sacrilegious and another side is doing their best to be as how would you say this, offensive, I guess, as possible.
Sure.
And in both cases, it doesn't particularly help. Of course, maybe it plays to the red meat of the crowd, and even when you're doing it on your own time, it's not even necessarily the same. But there's a lot gleaned from honest conversation. So I certainly appreciate you, saying that. And
that's all you and I've ever had, is just open, honest conversation.
Absolutely.
And we end up disagreeing, saying goodnight, and then doing it again later.
Yeah. And hopefully next time it'll be not quite as long. I did a look through, and I could be wrong about this. I think it is that 2021, but that seems so wrong to me because that would be in 6 days. That would be 2 years from now.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's no way, right? Like, I feel like there was at least one conversation in the calendar year of 2022, but I don't know.
Well, I mean,
you know what I mean?
because I see a lot of your stuff from social media and I comment on it, somewhat regularly. And so we've interacted that way lots, right? On a somewhat regular basis. So maybe that's what makes it seem like not so long.
I definitely could be. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But so yeah, why don't you tell everybody what prompted this conversation?
Absolutely. And so let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen real quick. So as you guys can see from the title here, we have it titled Morals, Judgments, and Memes with Michael, the Canadian Atheist. And the reason for that is because the catalyst for our conversation today was actually this meme right here. I had shared on my Facebook. You can see it's obviously not originally mine. It's from this site, Amorality of Atheism, or page, I guess it would be. I don't know if they have a corresponding site, so I don't necessarily. Anyways, not the point. But you can see the meme here. So it's this, the cat with his paws on either side doing the sort of twist thing. And the idea is, of course, supposed to be that you're jumping over yourself, trying to make two different things on opposing sides work. And it said, admitting that there are no objective moral values on one side and constantly making moral judgments about religion and religious people on the other side. And of course, the cat is titled Your Average Internet Atheist. And so that's the meme I shared. And for those who want a little bit of background, this is behind the idea that a goodly number of philosophers, certainly not all, but both on the theist and atheist side, have said something akin to, in the theist side, it's an argument, no God, therefore no objective values. And the atheist side, it's more of a affirmation, right? Yes, exactly. No objective moral values and duties. And so it's poking fun at the idea that the common philosophical claim on one side is that there is, in fact, no objective moral values and duties. Whereas on the other side, of course, there's a lot of talk about, it's the view on homosexuality is wrong, or on abortion is wrong, or slavery in the Bible is wrong, and all that kind of stuff. So it was poking fun at that whole deal. So there was a comment made by yours truly, Michael. Yours truly would actually be me, by Michael Stewart. Oh shoot, sorry. I don't know. I might have just.
Oh yeah, my name is Michael Stewart. Yeah, it's out there, man.
Okay.
I don't hide anything. Yeah, I'm pretty public. I'm pretty public.
Okay, I was just wondering. I was like, man,
No, you're good, man.
All right, cool. Thank you. So he said, I think about this a lot. I think it kind of depends on terms. If we take objective to mean stance or mind independent, which is its common usage, there can be no objective morality, because even if there are prescriptions like the 10 Commandments, these are still just based on what God wants or thinks. This is complicated. I think there are universals. I don't accept they come from a deity, because I am convinced there are none. Are they social conventions? Are they based on empathy? These are good questions. Maybe we need to chat about them. And the conversation beyond then was just basically, yes, actually, let's do that. So that was the catalyst for our conversation. And you can see actually based on, on my thumbnail that we have that meme posted up there. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, basically, is morality, whether or not it's objective, what it means to ground morality, whether or not it needs to be objective to mean anything. How can you make moral judgments if it's not objective? And all of that is based off of this meme. So thank you, Amorality of Atheism, for giving us the catalyst for what should be a very constructive dialogue. And I'll let you go ahead and comment on that before we move forward.
Yeah. So you read my comment. What do you think about my comment? So I guess the first thing, and it's weird, right? Because, we can get dragged into this kind of vortex of, it's like, oh, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? But I think it is important, right, for us to define terms. And this is why, it's like, so do you have a problem with the definition I put for, like, the kind of the standard definition for objective that I put forward?
So in that sense, no. I tend to add a little bit of a qualification. So stance, mind independent certainly is accurate, and I think the way that the well, at least the Oxford Dictionary defines it as not influenced by personal feelings, opinions, or anything of the like while considering facts, right?
Yeah, that sounds.
So
I haven't really looked it up, but that sounds right. Yeah.
Right. And either of those, I'm definitely okay with. The one thing I tend to want to add, just because I think it makes the conversation between a theist and an atheist a little bit more productive, is the word human. Because while there's a technicality that you even kind of referenced in your comment, where it was like, well, it's not technically stance or mind independent per se if it's based off of the decisions of God. Which I think might even be a point of conversation, because there's the point about it.
Well, yeah, for sure, right? Because if it is mind or stance independent, then it's mind or stance independent, full stop, right? To add the qualifier of human, right? And I hear this a lot, right? I'll hear people say things like, you start talking about various things, right? And people say, oh, that's a category error, right? So many, and I'm sure you see this all the time, right? Different, people like to put on their philosophy jackets. I tend to leave mine hanging in the closet because I know just enough philosophy to get myself into trouble. So, but people say, like that's a category error, and people will say, it's like, because you have to have, because God is special, God is different, this type of thing. And please, when I'm saying all this stuff, I mean, you and I know each other. So if you disagree with what I'm saying, just interrupt me, right? Mm-hmm. But that happens a lot, right? People will say that. But at least from my perspective, if it's mind or stance independent, it's mind or stance independent. And what it makes me think of sometimes is the Euthyphro dilemma, right? So, and for anyone who's not familiar, basically the Euthyphro dilemma basically says, is something good because God says it is good? Or does God see this thing, observe it is good, and then call it good? And I hopefully I didn't butcher that. I don't think that I did. And so what it basically says is, so if God observes something, sees that it's good, and then says, yes, that's good, then it is outside of him. So it couldn't be grounded in him. If it is that whatever God says is good, then the next logical step in that would be anything he says is good, regardless of what that anything is.
Right.
And I think that could be like when I was and I didn't think, these aren't things that I thought about when I was a Christian, which is a long time ago, but these aren't things that I thought about. I was much younger, and frankly, I hadn't read anywhere near as much. But I would think for fairly sophisticated believers now, like yourself, if I try to step inside your head for a second, that would be that would give me pause.
Well, so let me there's a lot of interesting points that I think are very relevant there. Well, actually, real quickly, let me just say thank you, Doki. Very much appreciate you. I want to just acknowledge that. So the first thing is, and I want to be clear, it's not that this doesn't have that there's not a cause for pause here, because it's not as simple as what I'm about to say. But in a sense, there is truth to the latter part. And I want to specify it is only in a sense, because like I said, I think the conversation on morality is deeper. But like I sometimes get annoyed with counter Muslim apologists, for example, when they constantly bring up Aisha. Now, I want to be clear, the whole thing with Aisha is deplorable. I mean, it was awful. And if you study her own life, you can tell, because she actually has writings that survive to this day, that she was very clearly traumatized by this. And it's a horrible, horrible thing. But the reason why I think it makes for a poor argument is because you got to work your way to that. If Allah really is God, it's like, okay, well, what are you going to do? Tell him no? You know what I mean? Like, it almost doesn't even make sense. It's like you gotta you got to work your way to the conversation of what, you know, okay, he's supposed to be morally perfect based off of the things we generally agree on as morals, right? Or what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao, which of course is based off of the Tao Te Ching, but nevertheless. And then from that point, all right, now we can start to ask the questions of whether or not these morals actually represent that, which if you do it the right way, it is a good argument. But if you just go straight in, well, Muhammad married a 9-year-old. It's like, right. But if God told him that was okay, and God actually is Allah, it's like you're arguing with the air. You know what I mean? There's an old quote where it's like, we can each argue about whether or not air exists, but while my opponent is making the case furiously that it does not, he's breathing it all the same. You know what I mean?
And it's interesting. Sorry to cut you off there, but you make an interesting point, and it's I think it's something that bears mentioning, because, you know, it's like as we get into this, right? There's this, you know, there's a ton of nuance in this. I've always found it, frankly, funny that people think that morality is is an easy thing to discuss. Like,
agreed.
I couldn't disagree with that more. Like, this is incredibly nuanced, right? And so to say, well, you know, it's just remember that song, that band called Live? They did that song Lightning Crashes and stuff like that. This is like from the early 90s. I'm dating myself again. Anyway, they had another song called The Beauty of Gray. And anyway, the chorus goes, "This is not a black and white world. We have to learn to appreciate the beauty of gray." And one of the things I like about that is that there, you know, that there's black and white on either ends of the spectrum. And yet in between that are these gradients, right? These shades of gray. And I'm not talking about shades of, you know, 50 Shades of Grey, the sex thing. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, you know, like within life, you know, it's like, well, you know, when people say, you know, that's a gray area, there are a ton of gray areas. And I think that's where a lot of us live our lives. Like, yes, there's good and bad, right? Neither one of us would argue there isn't good or bad. We, like someone would say, like, I remember I had a discussion with Andrew Rappaport, who runs the Apologetics Live YouTube channel. This is a number of years ago. And I said, we were having a conversation about morality. And I said, well, look at the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, right? Don't lie. Okay. But from my perspective, there are times when the most moral thing you can possibly do is lie. Everybody's heard the story about, you know, the Nazis at the doorway when you're hiding Jews in your attic, right? Everybody's heard that story a million times. From my perspective, the only moral thing to do is lie to protect those people, right? From the evil knocking on that door. And what Andrew said to me was, he says, no. He said, I wouldn't lie. And I said, well, how would you get away with that? And this is what he said to me. He said, so they knock at my door, right? And I'm, yep. And I open the door, and the question gets asked, are there any Jews here? And he would say, no, there are none. And I'd be like, well, then you'd be lying. He said, no, because there are no Jews standing right around me. There are no Jews right here. He actually said that to me. And I'm like, what? Like what kind of technicality crap is that? It didn't make any sense to me. But anyway, I derailed what you were going to say. I apologize.
Well, no, you're fine. And I want to actually note that real quick, because I think I have I won't call it a sufficient answer, because a lot of people much wiser than me need to think about it before we can decide whether or not it's sufficient. But nevertheless, I have concocted an answer for that particular question, and I'm interested to use it here in a second.
Sure.
But to get back to the question of the Euthyphro dilemma real quick, so there is a sense in which, and in fact, I'm even a divine command theorist, so there is a sense in which I think it is true that what God says is moral. And it's also part of why I think the stance independent from human perspective thing is important, because what we're actually asking is like whether or not these things are objective to the individuals existing within our sort of, I don't want to call it reality, because it sounds as if I'm saying God doesn't exist in reality, but I think you know what I mean, right? Like he's set apart from all the stuff that we have here, right? Mm-hmm. But the other reason why I think it's important, and this is also why I think the Euthyphro dilemma is not answered simply by biting the bullet on divine command theory, because then there's the question of, okay, you didn't really answer it. Why does God command things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that commands are not, how would I put this? They're not so much of a thought of God, so to speak, as much as they are either reflections of his nature or reflections of the authority which he has, right? So, for example, if we were to say something like "Thou shalt not steal," right? The idea is supposed to be because the wrongful theft of something that does not belong to you is something that is ultimately against the nature of God. And now I know that people like to bring up certain exceptions. Well, what about this, that, and the third? Mm-hmm. Exceptions can be made, and that's why I want to talk about that Jews in the attic thing in a moment. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, and then there's also matters of authority, right? Why is it wrong to take life or to accept worship? Well, because we don't really have the authority to do that. God is the giver and taker of life. He's the sole person who has authority to give it, and he's the sole person who has authority to take it. Now, he is sort of least authority to us in so much as that he allows us to have consensual sexual relationships and thereby produce children. And even in some instances, he leases the other end to us as well, saying things like capital punishment and warfare, at least in certain circumstances, are permissible. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, the Bible is rather clear that he gives and he takes away, and therefore to murder an image bearer of God it's just not something that you have the authority to do. Also, to accept worship is not something which you have the authority to do. There's also, of course, the added point I just brought up, image bearers, where every sin is said to be against God, and of course that's true because he's the ultimate arbiter of all things. But every sin is also a sin against God because it's a sin against an image bearer, right? And that goes for anybody, whether they believe or not, right? So on my worldview, you're an image bearer of God, and so if I were to wrong you, it's almost like wronging God by proxy. You know what I mean? Because of the fact that you're an image bearer. You can almost think of it like, in the ancient days, if I were to step on a idol of a king, it's like you're stepping on the king by proxy. It's disrespects to him, even though I didn't literally step on him. And there's a similar thing, I think, going on with human beings there as well. So the Euthyphro dilemma, in my opinion, would fail because, number one, it doesn't take into account, I think, the separatedness of God from man. Number two, I think it's because while it is true that commands are the things which we must ultimately obey, the things which we must ultimately follow, which define morality for us, it's also true that God is not commanding because he had an idea. He's commanding as a reflection of his nature or as a reflection of the authority that he has over us. And then thirdly, I would point out that I think that a big portion of the reason why sins are sins is because they're ultimately either something that is a sin against God directly or a sin against God by proxy, by sinning against somebody who is, say, a image bearer of him. So yeah, I don't want to go too far on that, but
no, it's fine. No, it's good. It's good to kind of like get your thoughts out. Yeah, and so if I put myself in your shoes, everything you said makes sense, right? Even from a divine command theorist perspective, right? I think what is it? Ephesians 1:11 says, everything is done, for God's purpose, right? So it's for His good pleasure that all these things happen. Whatever it is, doesn't matter what it is. And as a Calvinist, I think you would be in lockstep agreement with that.
Yeah.
He's got his reasons. His ways are higher than our ways, and that's just the way the cookie crumbles, right? And so it makes sense from that perspective. I've heard it said a lot of times, and it's I put on my most charitable hat. I understand that from that from your perspective, and this gets said a lot, right? Well, we have to understand, that there's there's who God is, but there's also this part of His nature, right? And so from my perspective, even at my most charitable, that sounds like a cope, because it's like either he wants these things, right? Like if God is omnipotent, and by omnipotent I mean, maximally powerful, given that he, still has to operate within the laws of logic, right? As powerful as God is, he can't make a one-ended stick, right? He can't make a squared circle, and he can't make a married bachelor, right? He can't contradict, he can't produce contradictory things, right? And so that's what I mean when I say these things. So, it's like if there are things that he wants, then these are his desires, right? Like he had his desire to, to make, men and women in his image. These are all his, desires. And so to say it's his nature, well, that, like, to me, that just sounds like a way of kind of getting around the uncomfortableness that is the somewhat nasty stuff that happens, right? At least from, and I'm just trying, like I said, I'm just trying to be, as charitable as possible, right? In this whole thing. And so it's, it's like if he wants it to happen, right? And I've heard guys like, like Matt Slitt talks about this stuff all the time, right? Like there's God's permissive will and his decretive will, right? His decretive will, from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, cannot not happen, right? If God decrees X to happen, X is going to happen, full stop. But then there's the permissive will, where he allows the things to happen, even though he may not necessarily want it to happen, like sin. Like God's obviously not a fan of sin, right? And if you look at sin as a transgression against the will of God, he obviously doesn't want it to happen, but he allows it to happen. These are things to me that pose cognitive dissonance. Like, what do you mean? Like you have the capacity to stop this, but as your permissive will, you allow to have happen what you don't want to have happen. And then I look at other Bible verses where it says stuff like, God wants, I forget the verse now, but God wants for no one, to die. He wants for everyone to be saved, right?
Not willing that any should perish. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. This doesn't compute for me, right? Given the things that we're talking about so far, right? And when we're talking about morality, it also doesn't make a lot of sense, because I forget where it is. It's in Jeremiah somewhere, where it says that, God has written the moral law on our hearts. Right? It says, like I will write my law on their hearts. Right. So it's there already.
Well,
sorry. Yeah. I'm going way overboard. So yeah, cut me off and say something.
Well, so with that, I would just add there's two different senses in which the Bible uses law written on human hearts. There's a sense which would be, in this conversation, exclusive to me, being that I am a Christian, and then there's a general sense as well. So the most clear place you can see this is you referenced Jeremiah 33. It says, "I will," and it's speaking about those who are in the new covenant, write my law on their hearts. New covenant, of course, is the language used for Christians, right?
Right.
That's supposed to be in a sense of like a desire, right? Contextually, it's like you desire to do the things which God wants over and against your inborn concupiscence, which is your natural inclination towards sin. You might still struggle with these things, but there's supposed to be that change, right? Whereas with the general sense, it's more like it's a little bit more vague. Like it's enough to condemn. It's enough for people to know they're doing wrong. And it's even enough for them to change that a little bit and understand, okay, we want to do something that is better than that. I think it'd be equivalent to kind of what you would see as empathy in a sense, right? But it's not as robust, you know what I mean? And you can kind of, I even see that whether or not this is truth to the claim or not, you can at least see the operation of it in real life, in so much as that, like, Christians, for example, even if they are, for example, fornicating, right? It tends to be like a struggle, right? Where they're like they feel bad about it kind of thing, right? Whereas on the flip side, I'm not even sure that you would consider that something that's wrong. It's just something that humans do. You know what I mean?
As long as we're talking about consenting adults, yeah, I don't care.
Right, exactly, right. But on the same token, there's also certain things which seem almost intuitive to both of us, right? Where it's like, for example, killing somebody. It seems just like nobody had to really tell you that was wrong. You just kind of always had a gut feeling that's wrong. I don't know if I like.
And that's true, except where it isn't. Right. So, for example, psychopaths, right, that have organic brain disorders, and not only do they not see the problem with causing harm, but actually derive pleasure from causing harm. So it's like, and this is, kind of like, like little, kind of like as friendly a poke as I can give. It's like, yeah, it's ever present, except when it's really not.
Yeah, and even in a sense, I can say that that's almost true, right? And what I mean by that, first off, we have to acknowledge, right, like all humans have 2 feet except when they don't, right? It's a similar thing there where it's like there is such thing as deficiencies, and with utmost respect to people who are handicapped, that is a deficiency, right? You're supposed to have 2 feet. That's the design, if you will. But unfortunately, whether it's inborn or due to some tragic event, sometimes that's not how it happens, right? Mm-hmm. So we do have to acknowledge that. The other thing, though, is, it's interesting. Psychopaths still feel like it's wrong to kill them and the people that they enjoy. You know what I mean? So it's almost like you can't completely remove, or like to steal from. If I were to steal from Jeffrey Dahmer, he's still mad I stole from him. And he even would, more than just an emotional reaction, he even still has this feeling of like, that was wrong. You shouldn't do that. You know what I mean? Now, for him to steal from somebody else, for whatever reason, he sees it completely differently.
And it's funny. There are, and this is kind of getting into the area we talked about before, kind of the area of my expertise, right? My formal education. and there are, it's like, so there's a spectrum, right? So like within the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, there's very little that is carved in stone, so to speak. And what I mean by that is that there are spectrum disorders, right? That operate within that kind of gray area that I mentioned before, right? So yes, you will find psychopaths who do have the capacity to say, well, I want to do what I want to do, but I don't want you to do, to me what I don't want done to me, right? And then there are those that are like, I once heard it described by a colleague as like a psychopathic anarchist, where it's like, it's like, yeah, it's like, I want to do these things. If it happens to me, it's like, okay, I'd rather it didn't happen, but I get it, right? Because I'm still going to do, and so there is this broad spectrum. And so we have to be, just mindful of when we're saying, that's like, well, psychopaths still know. Because yes, there are some that do, but there are some that don't. Like there is this wide spectrum within psychopathy.
So with that, I did want to just to sort of steer this a little bit to.
Yeah, you got to steer it. Otherwise, we're going to go off the deep end, man. Like right. for everyone watching this, CJ and I have the capacity to take this to very weird places. And all of a sudden, 4 hours later, it's like, I have to go to bed, CJ.
Right. Somehow the conversation is centered around Darth Vader.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyways, so to get to some more of the substance we would have here, right? So we brought up the classic dilemma, right? Jews in the attic, and I'm
really curious to what you have to say about this. Yeah, I want to hear this.
Yeah, and the first thing I'd point out is that I think a lot of times people, when they are talking about this, they mean it as a means to question whether or not morality is truly objective, right? Because it seems like for example, you brought up the lies. If lies are truly wrong, then your only option in this situation is to do something wrong, right? And to me, the dilemma actually only works if morality is objective. In other words, there's no dilemma if morality is not objective. It's basically just do whatever ends up being more in tune with the way you feel about it. Now, for most people, that's going to be lying, But of course, there's going to be those people who that's not actually the case, right? But it's not a real dilemma any more than do I want Cocoa Pebbles or Fruity Pebbles is a real dilemma. In so much as, and I'm not saying that to dismiss it, but I'm saying it is to say that might be a genuine thing you sit there in the cereal aisle and think about for 10, 15 minutes because you really like both and you only have enough money for one, right? But in the end, that's as far as the dilemma goes. There's no right or wrong answer, right? From my perspective, being that I think morals are objective, it is a dilemma because both answers are wrong. And you're put in a situation where I can either lie, thereby doing something immoral that way, or I can reveal the innocent Jewish people in my household to the Nazi and thereby do something immoral that way. And that also, I think, allows us to have a solution to the problem, which is if things are objective, then they also, it seems logical that they should necessarily have some kind of objective value to them, right? So, for example, if I have $1 bill and $5 bill, these are not technically objective per se, but just assuming for a moment that currency was set in stone, the 5 has an objectively higher value than the 1 does, right? And so I can say this 5 is worth more. If I only have the opportunity to grab 1 and both are floating out in the sea, I'm going to grab the 5 because that is objectively worth more, even though I am losing money. I'm losing the 1, right? But I gained more money by getting the 5. Likewise, I think the same can be said of morals. If we have 2 options which are bad, and we're only put in a situation to have 2 bad options, not because of our own selves, but because of some evil third party that's forcing us to be in the situation, I can, because I believe both are objective, I can say one is objectively more valuable than the other, and thereby say, okay, there is more value in preserving an innocent human life than there is in telling the truth. And in that instance, of course, and then the other thing to add to that, which I just kind of hinted to, is while it is true that there is no technically right answer in the sense that there's nothing you can do that's not immoral if morals are objective, there is still a actually right answer, because anything you do in that situation, not only are you picking the more valuable thing over the less valuable thing, but you're also not the reason it's happening, right? Like if you're stuck in a situation where you have 2 wrong options, but one option is less wrong than the other, and I'm the one putting you in there. I mean, I could hold the wrong option you chose against you, even though it's the better one, but really it's my fault, right? I'm the one who did that. You're just reacting to the outside stimuli, right? And I think you could almost give an example of this in things which, while highly controversial, are very real. I think we would probably both agree that taking human life is one of those things where it's like, yeah, it is something which is legitimately always tragic. At the same time, it does have to happen, though. It rarely does have to happen, but like if somebody's breaking into your house and you happen to have a club, and and they're threatening your family, it's like, well, with all due respect, Mr. Sir, my club and my family are going to take precedent over your life. You know what I mean? Yeah. And you're the one who put me in that situation by breaking in, not me. You know what I mean? So, but I don't think you can really make that kind of a rationality. That's not the way you would word that. Make that kind of a rational deduction if morals aren't objective, right? It seems like that's reliant upon the whole dilemma itself, as well as its solution, are reliant upon the idea that both really do have a kind of objective value.
So it's interesting, right? Because then it goes back to what we said before, right? Because I don't think it does if we use the normative definition of being mind or stance independent, because it's still just what we think, right? And that's what I wrote in the post, like universals, right? Like, and that's why, like, I think there are universals, right? Like we can see, like this is something that and again, an incredibly nuanced position, right? I know how you feel, for example, about abortion. I am personally pro-life. I think that human life is precious and we should do as much as we can to protect it. However, and everybody get ready to either face palm or punch your computer screen, people that are watching. I think that I personally draw a line for myself there where I'm not prepared to tell someone else what they can do with their bodily autonomy. So I kind of walk this fine line where it's like, if you don't think abortion is right, then you totally should never get an abortion. But I don't think that you should be telling other people what they can and can't do with their own bodies, because you would never want to have your bodily autonomy infringed upon in that way. Now, neither one of those situations does away with the universal agreement that you and I have that human life is precious. We agree that that is a universal truth. Human life is precious, right? We agree that like with the like with the and maybe that's why the Nazis ones are always hard. Like maybe I should have used the trolley problem instead. I'm sure everybody's familiar with what the trolley problem is.
Yeah.
Maybe that would have been a better example. Who cares? Doesn't matter. You're what?
Oh, I said yeah, but then I said, well, I guess I am, but I guess I'm not sure if the audience is. But
yeah.
Anyways,
we can talk about it if we need to. Anyway, but we can look at or at least I would say it's more, if this makes sense, more universal, that the protection, like, because again, I look at the situation where, I'm the person answering the door, right? In the Second World War, and it's the Nazis at the door, right? In my mind, the only thing to do is lie. Like that's I could not allow myself to say, oh yeah, they're right up there, have at it, right? Like that would be evil from my perspective, right? Because I don't see lying as always a bad thing, right? And I also don't think sin is a thing, right? Sin, a transgression against God. Of course, I don't think sin is a thing because I don't think God is real, right? Those aren't things that I can, kind of square with in my own mind. Like, don't you think sin is bad? No, because for me, sin is a made up word. Doesn't exist.
And while I think that you're even right, not only can I say I sympathize, I even think you're right as far as the answer is definitely you lie, right? But what I'm saying is that I think the answer is definitely you lie because both have a real value and one's value outweighs the other, right? Like it seems to me like if both values are subjective, you're not really correct or commendable for lying. You kind of just did what you felt. You as they say, you lived your truth, quote unquote, right? And I may ultimately agree with that truth, but somebody somewhere doesn't. In fact, many people I think don't. There's a lot of people, especially on my side of things, right, as far as the socially conservative, socially liberal thing, where they value authority more than they would value principle and stuff like that. Which, by the way, I'm not saying that's all conservatives. I'm also not using the word conservative politically, but in a social sense. Yeah. But nevertheless,
it is interesting. I mean, it's an interesting point, right? Like, it's like, so, it's like, when is lying wrong? Well, I think lying to my spouse is like lying to my wife is wrong, unless it's, concealing something I've planned for her surprise birthday party. Then I'm going to lie to her, right? Or, it's like, or, you've heard the story about, the whole, the 97-year-old grandmother comes downstairs, it's like, oh, do I look okay? Oh, grandma, you look gorgeous, right? Even though she looks like an old leather boot, right? With a dress on. So, it's like there are certainly times when I would say, yeah, lying is wrong. It's like, I'm not going to lie to my wife about something that's very important. But I'm going to lie to my wife under certain circumstances. Like I said, planning her surprise birthday party or something like that. Right. And, lying and you like, I knew, and I don't know whether it's because we've spoken about this before or it's just what I know of you. Like, no way would CJ turn the Jews in the attic over to the Nazis. Like, no way would he do that. I knew that before I even posed the question, because I know that's not who you are as a person. Right. And so, but it is interesting the way you kind of pose, it's like where, it's like we see the right and the wrong in both of it. And I think that's true. And I think that's where it does fall to subjectivity, right? Because there are there are times when you would see lying as, no, I can't lie about that. But with the other situation, it's like, no, I have to lie about that because the other is a terrible thing. And that's falling to our subjective opinion. And I think that if you were put in that situation, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you would struggle with it at the time, right? So, you know, you're huddled in your house, and you know the Nazis are going door to door. You know they're trying to round up the Jews to kill them, and you know the knock at the door is coming because they're knocking on everybody's door. And I know that you,
point of order, I'd actually be the one in the attic, unfortunately. So,
well, yeah, okay, but you know, let's okay, say it's me,
I get
right?
it. Yeah,
because I'm just a white dude, right? But you know, it's like, you know, like you'd be struggling with that, and I think what you would end up doing is, I think you would end up maybe in the moment you would pray, and you would say, you might pray something like, you know, God, I know, you know, I have to lie. I know it's against one of your commandments. I know you don't like, I know you don't like that, but you know, I'm weighing these two options, and I hope you'll forgive me. And then you would lie.
Yeah. Like, well, and there's, like I said, I think there's a lot of, first off, yeah, absolutely. It's one of those situations where I think 100% of the time in that situation, the answer is you definitely tell the lie, right? And I do kind of get what you mean in the subjective sense, in so much as that I think each person is going to have to go through the dilemma themselves. Certainly, like nobody can go through the dilemma for you and then say, all right, A is the right answer, therefore choose A, right? But if there is actually a right answer, and that's sort of, I think, the crux of where I would say here, and actually in a very real sense, this, I think, explains our differences on, say, like the abortion issue, right? Okay. So we both take this universal on human life to be true. At least that's our affirmation, right?
Yes.
And believe it or not, we would even both have an affirmation that bodily autonomy is incredibly important. In fact, I am quite stringent on the, I can't really say explicitly because this video will get taken down, but the great event of a couple years ago, you know what I mean? That there was serious violations of bodily autonomy during that situation that I think they were not acceptable, right? So we both are affirming these two truths, right? But because of the fact that I think each of those truths has a certain value, right? And I think we can actually come to a correct, and I mean factually correct, like correct, independent of what another man might think about it. I think we can come to a correct conclusion of it. That leads me to the conviction to say, okay, either one of these has to take a backseat to the other, in which case, and well, let me just explain exactly what I'm meaning, right? So for me, the personally but politically thing doesn't really make sense because I think of these things as having values, right? And because I think those values as being objective. So if I say I'm personally pro-life and I believe that is an absolute moral imperative, right? Then there's no situation in which I could be anything other than politically pro-life, because I think that's an objective value that ultimately, while I affirm bodily autonomy as being of incredible importance, it's not of paramount importance. It's not of such a great importance that I could justify what I see as the deliberate taking of life, right? And I want to stress there too, deliberate, because I know the question may come up, well, we just brought up the event of a couple of years ago. Doesn't that seem to contradict that? Well, it's not deliberate at that point. It's at best, it's negligence, right? And of course, there's all the questions as far as whether or not we had the right data and all that kind of stuff, but I don't want to get into that because that could be a complete derailment. But you see what I mean? Where it's like, so I think the affirmation that life is objectively valuable and it is just a moral imperative. It's a fact just as much as gravity pulls us down to the center of mass is a fact. That you cannot take innocent life without just cause, right?
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's like I think that again, getting hooked up on this, and I think it's like I understand your perspective, right? Because you you were careful about saying that you were adding the caveat of human, into your definition of objective, right? I get that. It makes perfect sense from your perspective. For me, that's all there is, right? So I don't have to add that, that little bit into it, right? So, but my stance is my quote unquote, like, and it is also my subjective opinion that it is universal, right? I think for the most part it is. I mean, I think if you polled, people, like in general, like just do polls at random polls all over the place, I think you'd be hard pressed to find people not agreeing to a statement like, human life is precious. Like, I don't think I want to be too close to people that answer no to that question, right? I think I want to be away from those people. But it's, so I think it's fair to say, yes, universally, but not objectively, right? Like, not mind or stance independent. Like from your perspective, it's your opinion, and it's your opinion because of the stance that you take, which would meet the criteria for subjective. To add the bit human, right, and then to place God outside of that category, because it's his nature and he's special, and I'm not trying to be uncharitable when I say that, I think just kicks the can further. I think it just kicks the can further down the road, right? Like, maybe we can apply Occam's razor here and say, that we shouldn't multiply entities unnecessarily. Like, we don't have to add this other stuff to it. We can come to these understandings without having to add these other things. You can't do that because of your stance, right? I can because of my stance, your opinion versus my opinion of it, right? And that's why I think we have to be careful about using that term objective versus subjective, right? Because when it comes right down to it, at least from my perspective, even the things that God wants, like, those are his desires, his subjective desires.
Yeah, and this is, I think, where the one of the points where we have probably the greatest disagreement.
Shock of all shocks, we disagree.
Right. And so, and I brought up with this how did I call it, the Jews in the attic dilemma,
Yeah.
right? How I thought it was a matter of values, and of course, ultimately, on my view, those values are, while I think that they are legitimately true values, they are values which you could reasonably push back on by saying, okay, but who made the valuation to begin with? Which, of course, the answer there would be God, right? Like, there is somebody who calculated, if you will, the value of these things, and now I can say, or now you can say rather, that makes the situation subjective, right? And I think there are a couple things which are, in my opinion, at least, very important to note. So, like, for example, when we say, okay, it's subjective because it's ultimately dependent on God's stance, the first issue with it is, and I'd say this respectfully, but I don't know if that point is necessarily relevant. And the reason I say that is because we're not really, like, let's just bite the bullet. And I wouldn't bite the bullet, by the way, but just for the sake of a small argument, let's just bite the bullet and say, okay, yeah, no, totally, God is arbitrary, and it is, and I know you're not even saying that, but we could just take it all the way, right? It's arbitrary based on whatever.
I don't know that I wouldn't say that.
Fair, actually, definitely fair. So we just bite that and say, okay, but ultimately, that doesn't change anything as far as the way we experience, talk about, and think about morality in the here and now, right? Like, if it's arbitrarily the case that God says murder is murder, or murder is wrong, rather, right? So be it. But you and I still have a standard that neither of us can have an opinion to change, right? You can almost think of it in that sense like the law. the law is subjective. A bunch of people got together, they passed a law, right? 35 miles per hour is the speed limit here. Or
Yep.
I don't know what the equivalent in kilometers would be, but nevertheless,
60.
60. Okay. So 35 miles per hour / kilometers per hour is the speed limit here. That is subjective. A bunch of people got together, and pointing it out almost makes no difference, because we still have to follow that regardless of if I think it's a good law and you don't. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, I would wholly concede that. Like, if it is the case that all the things that you believe are true, then what you and I think doesn't amount to a hill of beans. It is the way it is, because, whether you want to throw the potter and the clay analogy, right, or the the people throw it as the creator creature distinction, or God versus his creation, these other things. If it is the case that the things you believe are true, yeah, then it doesn't. Then nothing we say matters. It is the way it is, because why? Because.
Yeah, and you can see then how that almost makes the question of, and I want to address whether or not it's subjective in a real sense in a moment, but
sure.
Just leaving that to the side for a moment, I'm sure you could see why that, from my perspective, almost makes it seem like, okay, the question of whether or not it's arbitrary or subjective from God's point of view almost just becomes irrelevant, because it's functionally objective for you and I, even if it's not legitimately objective in this grand metaphysical sense. You know what I mean?
Yes and no, and I don't think we can get around the fact that we have this very strict divergence at this point, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's like, because for you to say, it's like, well, it just is the way it is, so it's functionally objective, whereas I will say, well, it's functionally subjective. Like, it is what it is. Again, as you said before, biting that bullet. All the things that CJ believes is true. God is real. He's the Calvinist God. It's all those things. They are all true. They are all still like, it's like, thou shalt do no murder. Why? Because God said so.
So I guess to an extent, it seems to me like, even on that scenario where it's simply that and nothing further. And again, I do think there is some further, but like I said, just biting that bullet, if I were to have that view, it's almost like you can have a, how would you say, like you imagine somebody who's I don't know, going down something that's, let's say they're in the process of being eaten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex or some animal that's big enough that they can fit in their entire mouth, right?
Okay.
And the chomp hasn't come down yet, so they're not actually dead. And It's like, okay, yeah, but in that moment, they're dead. You know what I mean? Like, the functionality of it has gotten to the point of where arguing the semantics almost, it just seems so irrelevant almost. You know what I mean? Because you're in that scenario where the argument of, yeah, not technically, but I will be in a moment, or yeah, no, you're dead. Ultimately, we're both going to agree, okay, but give it a nanosecond or two, and it's going to be the case, right? It's almost a similar thing that we have going on here, where it's like, okay, so are we saying that God has subjectively decided it, or legitimately, has some sort of objective reasoning behind it or something like that? And those arguments each go their own separate way, but they ultimately end back at the same place, which is, if that's true, every time, regardless of circumstance, regardless of stance of individual minds, it's wrong. So it's like, that's why I say it, like, it's almost like it's a functional objectivity anyways. Because if God is arbitrary and you go out and murder somebody because you feel like that's not something that could be wrong, and maybe I should use something that's less harsh because I'm not trying to besmirch your character, but it just wouldn't even matter. You know what I mean? It'd be like, okay, well, what are you going to do? Tell him no? Well, I don't feel that way, God. That's fantastic. You know what I mean?
Oh, no, it's exactly right. I mean, it's like, and I've had these similar discussions with believers a lot, right? Like, it's like, if I were to find my faith again, I think I would lie. I think you and I would align on a few things. And I think I would kind of fall the way of divine command theorist, because it's like, at the end of the day, if these things are true, then it doesn't, like, my thoughts, feelings, whatever it is, are irrelevant. God said X, therefore X, right? It is the way it is. Why? Because he said so, right? And for anyone who's watching, who's a parent, right? Or, well, let's maybe not who's parents. Well, we were all kids, right? And when we were doing something we weren't supposed to be doing, or we wanted something, and we went to our parents, and let's say, they were flustered. It was the end of a busy day, and they had listened to enough of our garbage for the day. And we, Mom, Dad, blah, 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 blah. I want this. Can I have this? No. Why? Because I said so. Right. I think we all heard that as kids. And it was the most unsatisfying answer in the world. Because we're like, what do you mean because you said so? I've told you all the reasons why I want this thing. And you're saying no. And you're saying, well, just because I said so. Right. And in the same way, it doesn't matter. Right. We're like, we were the children, and the parents, the ones in charge, said no. Why? Because. And so I think, like I said, I think if I found my faith again, I think you and I would align on that point. And from my perspective, and maybe a lot of believers wouldn't get traction with this, talking to a lot of other atheists, because I think there are other atheists that aren't particularly charitable, and they're just looking for the blood sport in something too, and all they want to do is point out all the ways you're wrong and stupid and silly. But from me, if, like, you'd almost get more traction from me, or more respect from me, if you said, look, I believe this thing because, God's powerful, he's the boss, and he just said it, right? Drop the idea of objectivity, right? Even drop the argument of it's in God's nature. From me personally, you're gonna get more from me just by saying, you know what, he's God, and he can do what he wants.
Yeah, and I do even think that is I think it's a perfectly legitimate argument. So I wouldn't even necessarily, while I wouldn't drop some of the other stuff, I would affirm that. And even, like I said, I would even use that to say, even on the view of, okay, well, technically this is still subjective. I'd just be like, okay, well, tomato in a sense, from my perspective, where it's like that sounds like it's functionally objective, even if it's not totally objective, right? But then there becomes a second element of this as well, which is why I think there's an answer to the Euthyphro dilemma.
Okay.
Which is to say, because when we're saying it's a matter of God's nature, right? Now, nature is a complicated term, to say the least. But just as a manner that, like, it is in a bird's nature, I guess specifically a bird with flight, to fly, right? Because, there's penguins and whatnot. But
except for ostriches.
Yeah, except ostriches, penguins. So it's like or you could say maybe even a better example, because there is the difference. It's within a bird's within a fish's nature to live in the water. It's almost definitional, right? Fish are things which live in the water, sure. Right? That's not the only thing that is part of their definition, but it's a huge part of it, right? Mm-hmm. So you can't do, as a fish, you can't do anything other than live in the water. Right. Sure. So if we were to say, okay, it's within God's nature to have morality set out in this way, then you also have the situation which God is in. He's created all things. He's an unchanging being. He's an immutable being, and he is how would you say this? He's not capable of going against his nature, which to a certain extent, I don't think any creature is capable of going against their nature. That's not something unique to God. That's just, if it's a part of your nature, definitionally you can't go against it. If it's not a part of your nature, then that's something which
I think I agree with that. Like, it's like another way to put it would be, there is no one who doesn't behave in accordance with their beliefs.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So now you would take that back then to a God, right? If God is an eternal and unchanging being who ultimately creates all things as well, which means that he reflects all of the elements of his nature onto his creation, because it is his creation. That's almost definitional, right? You can glean some from George Lucas by reading Star Wars or by watching Star Wars. There's a sense there then where even from his perspective, it is truly objective, because it can't really be any other way. Like, God couldn't decide at some point that he thought murder was okay. Not because there's something outside of him which says that murder is okay, but because he within himself has this certain nature about him that is unchanging and that has been around without beginning and without end eternally, right? Atemporally. And that, I think, almost you can kind of, and I hasten to add here really quick for my Christian audience, which of course is most of them because this is a Christian channel. Don't read too much into this because I don't mean it literally. But you can almost think of God as a Platonic object at that point, which, by the way, many theistic philosophers do essentially have this idea of Platonism, but rather than Platonic objects, it's God's own nature, which I think I would probably fall into that category as well, right? Where it's like he has this thing which is fundamentally a part of the way he is, and he's not capable of changing that thing because he's an immutable being. Or I guess, immutable actually doesn't necessarily mean without change, but nevertheless, he's a being that does not change, and he's been around forever, so it's always been that way. So you see what I mean? It's like it won't be different 5 seconds from now because he can't change, and it's been this way since the beginning of time, and even before that, because he's been around for the all of it, even beyond the all of it, right? And so it's hard to take this position where, like, if I can just kind of reduce this,
of course.
The position which God occupies, having those qualities, makes it I think just as objective as anything else could be, because it's independent of even his mind at that point to an extent, because it's not something he's deciding or having an opinion on. It's something that's actually a reflection of his immutable and eternal nature. You see what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting because and again, putting my believer's hat on for a second, I don't have a problem with the whole unchanging God thing. I think it's Malachi 3 something that says, I the Lord do not change, right? So okay, that's cool, whatever. And but something you said that's interesting there, that's kind of like almost outside of him, that like outside of him, then you could maybe argue is where objectivity would lie. But that would also mean that it doesn't come from him.
I guess. So how do you mean by from, I guess?
So like a minute ago, you said, that it's, part of his nature and it's unchanging.
Right.
And I think your words were that that's almost like it's not even a part of him, or you said something to that effect. And if it's not
something that, yeah, I know what you're saying. Not something which is like derived from his mind per se, as much as it is just derived from. And you can even give an example of this with a human being. Whatever it is, you're drinking something, I've noticed. You didn't really say again.
Just Diet Coke, yeah.
Yeah. So, you never really decided at any point that you like or like rationally thought about liking Diet Coke. You either did or you didn't, right? Even if it grew on you at some point and you didn't like it beforehand, it's not something that came out of your mind. It's something that comes from something that's a little bit more primal, what philosophers would refer to as your nature, right? You just do like it. There's this old saying, I bring it up constantly in conversations about free will, where it's like man can do what he wills, but he can't will what he wills. The idea is basically, it's an Arthur Schopenhauer quote. He's basically saying you don't have a control over those things which are a part of your nature. They just are. So that's why I say it's independent from your mind, because there's nothing rational per se about it. That's not a negative. It's just the truth, right? It's not, you didn't calculate, okay, well, if I drink it with my sandwich, I guess then I could probably enjoy a Diet Coke. You know what I mean? It's a lot more primal than that.
Yeah, it's interesting though. But all the things you're saying, rationalize, think about, contemplate, those are all things that happen inside the mind, right? Like, it's like all these things, like, it's like, just like we're talking right now, right? When we're talking, all we're doing is thinking out loud, right? And it's all a response to, chemical reactions in our brain. I've heard people say all the time, "Oh, you think we're just chemical reactions?" Like, yeah, that's quite literally all we are, is chemical reactions. But it's like, it's none of those things. It's like we can't have desires outside of our brain, because that's where desires come from. We can't have thoughts outside of our brain. That's not coherent at all. All of those things come from, like, it is either outside of us or it's not.
Yeah, but
if it's inside, that's where I just think definitionally, then it's subjectivity.
See, but I think where the rub here would kind of come from is when you're saying, it's either internal or it's not. And I would affirm that it is internal. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a function of mind or not, right?
What else could it be?
Well, I think that nature and mind have to be separated. I think mind is more active. It's more rational, like I said, right? Like, as a function of my mind would be something like when I deliberately act to do something, right? Okay. There's a calculation, there's a choice, there's a limited extent that I'm being rational, right? Mm-hmm. Even if I'm making a completely irrational decision. Whereas with something that's more an element of my nature, it just is. And there is no rationality, there is no calculation, there is no.
That's interesting. Okay, so let's say instead of nature, let's call it instinct. Is that fair?
Yeah, instinct, intuition, that kind of thing could work.
Is a lion's instinct to kill a gazelle come from outside of it?
I guess I would probably say no. Seems to me that the answer to that would be no.
So then how can anything else's instinct or nature come from outside of it?
Yeah, I'd have to think about that for a minute. I don't know necessarily that it would. I guess so. The reason I'd have to think about it for a minute is because I wonder, that obviously one's will or instinct or intuition or what have you. I think we could use all of those terms as nature as well, almost interchangeably.
I think they're synonyms for sure. Yeah.
I think it is built from. It can be at least built from external circumstances, maybe genetics or maybe the species you are. That's not even. It's weird to even call it external though, because your genetics are still kind
internal.
of a part of. Yeah, exactly.
All inside of us. Right?
So I think tentatively, I'd have to say, yeah, I don't know if anything would. But the thing is, and I'm saying tentatively because I want to be honest about the fact.
Sure, of course, yeah. It's like, we know each other well. Like, neither one of us is going for gotcha moments here, right? That's not what either one of us is about.
Right. And I appreciate that, by the way. But if in fact that is true, I think that would work rather well for the point I'm trying to make, because it would be saying this nature, will, instinct, intuition of God is not derivative from something outside of him. It's something which is just fundamentally a part of him, right? And it's something which is not, it still remains mind or stance independent, because it's not something which he is taking any active, rational thought into. It's just simply something that is. And so if that were the case, there would just be this truth that God, as just a matter of brute fact, is this way. And beyond that, we could speculate, I guess, on a reason, but I doubt it would go anywhere. That fact is the very definition of a brute fact, is that it couldn't go anywhere, right? That's a circular fact. But so it seems to me like that would actually, if that is the case, would be probably a decent argument for what I'm kind of trying to say here, right? Where it's like, and this is, remember, we already have the point of its functional objectivity for us. But then if it's also true that God's decrees, God's commands, what have you, are something which he is not rationalizing about, but which are rather just fundamentally a part of him, in so much as that it derives from him naturally. And I use that not, well, I think
I know what you mean.
Yeah. Then it would seem like we've also gotten over the issue in a more concrete sense. It's no longer is it just, well, he said, and therefore it's objective for us, but it's also like, this is just the way it is. He couldn't have, there's no scenario in which God could have given a different set of commandments, because the commandments fundamentally derive from something which is not even separate from him in so much as his mind. It's even more primal than that, right? Yeah.
But you heard what you just said, right? It's not separate from him.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that would be right. I think in that sense that would certainly be accurate.
What's the difference between not being separate from him and being subjective?
Well, if we go with that definition we had earlier of stance or mind independent, I think the main difference there would just be that it is, in fact, independent of any of his cognition, for lack of a better term, although that's a weird term to use for a deity, or a stance that he might have. And you could almost kind of say, like, hunger is not subjective, right? But it does derive from within you. But it's a bodily reaction. You either are or are not hungry. And you might be able to say, well, I'm less hungry now than I was then, or I can deal with this hunger in a more robust way, or what causes me to be hungry may be less than what causes you to be hungry, or even more, depending on what we're doing, or different ages or stuff like that. But it's not subjective, right? You are hungry as a matter of fact.
Yeah, but I think that's the reason I think that's a bad example. I'm going back to kind of like early biology lessons, but unless I'm mistaken, hunger comes from the hypothalamus, which is just above the amygdala, which is a biological part of our brain. So it does come from inside of us.
Right, but that's exactly what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is it is something which is internal, but it's not something which is subjective.
It's right? Wholly subjective.
I don't think it is, though, because it's a bodily reaction. You matter-of-factly are hungry, independent of your own stance, right? Like if you're fasting, for example, you don't want to eat because of your fast. Well, that's fantastic, but you can't tell yourself you're not hungry. You are, in fact, hungry.
Right. But that's still coming from inside. That's not coming from outside of you.
Right, but that's a different definition, right? We're talking about
it's a biological reaction, no?
No, exactly. I think I want to try and make sure I'm wording this correctly, because that's exactly what I'm saying, right? I'm saying it's an internal thing.
Yeah.
But it's not stance or mind dependent. You see what I mean?
Completely mind dependent, completely biologically dependent.
Right, but but biology is not mind.
Well, no, I can't agree with that, because we don't have any examples of minds absent bodies.
Well, so then let me rephrase it in a way that would be agreeable then. Biology is not something which is determinative based on your functions of mind, your rational thought, in other words.
See, I still can't reconcile that, because again, so the only examples of minds so to me, and this is where again we're going to diverge, right? Because my understanding is the mind is what the brain does, right? They're intrinsically linked, right? And the reason I believe this is because we know that we can damage our mind if our like our minds can be altered if our physical brain is damaged.
Right.
Right. If I give you a frontal lobotomy, you are not the same CJ anymore.
Yeah, it's there's a what's the famous case? Phineas Gage, right? Where he got the pin through his head.
Yeah. So like those are those couple of the reasons why I take the stance that I do. And it's interesting. It's like I think for the person, I think for the believer, sometimes there's, and maybe it comes down to, and then maybe we have to start thinking about wrapping up, is I'll never get down on someone who's and I'm wondering how much of this like falls into this category, right? So Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. When somebody tells me that they, where you get to a certain point and then the rest of it is kind of taken up with faith, I never get down on a believer when they say something like that, because it's kind of in your rule book, which is fine. And I'm wondering, and I'm not looking, and this is one of the things we were talking about before, where people will be like, why didn't you keep pounding them on this point? But is there a part of this, CJ, where faith is a portion of this?
Well, in this specific sense, not so much.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because I actually, I was more of a, how would you put this? I want to make sure I'm wording this correctly. So a big portion of how I came to faith was through philosophy of ethics.
Okay.
So in other words, it's not like something where it's like, okay, I became a Christian and now I need to think about philosophy of ethics and how would this work on a Christian worldview. It was more, I like philosophy of ethics, and my thoughts of philosophy of ethics were leading me to think, okay, the Bible and the idea of theism are more likely to be true than not. And of course, there's plenty of things to add to that, because that wasn't the end of it. In fact, at the end of that particular journey, I wouldn't even consider myself to be a legitimate Christian. I would more consider myself to be like a philosophical Christian, where it was like these ideas make a lot of sense, but I don't really, I don't really care for the deity aspect, right? And of course, that changed over time, or at least the theity, which is the word I just made up. But the difference between deism and theism.
Sure.
But so let me, I think, and I do want to respect your time, so we'll have to wrap this up soon. But would you? So you would argue that the mind and the brain are the same thing, and I think I can grant that with making the case that I'm making. Perhaps I can't, but I'm going to try. When a person is brain dead, they do still have to eat. Right? Now, they don't have to eat hum, because they can't, of course. But the doctors have to replace the small amount of energy, the small amount of calories that are being dispersed, lest the body wither away and die. Right?
So the mind doesn't. And I don't even know. I mean, I'm not sure what happens like in brain death. I'm not sure. There wouldn't be hunger responses from the brain. If you're brain dead, that wouldn't come. But you would still need to give the physical body calories to survive. Yeah.
Right. So in that scenario, what we're seeing demonstrated is that hunger, if defined strictly in a scientific sense, right, which is to say the need for your body to replace energy dispersed with new energy, right, is independent even of your brain, because the brain is non-functional at that point, but you still need to replace the dispersed energy, right? Or depleted energy.
Yeah, but the reason why that argument doesn't hold is because there are so many other bits of stimuli, right? Like, so I mean, you will open your phone or you'll go turn on your TV after this and you'll see a commercial for some burger chain and you'll see a hamburger flying across the screen, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I want that, right? You're not hungry, right? Because you had dinner an hour. Let's just say you had dinner an hour ago, right? You're not hungry, but you want that, right? And that those are other impulses in the brain, right? Like the brain seeking out those hits of dopamine and stuff like that, right? Like we for example, like we get the same dopamine response from our brain from chocolate that we do from heroin. You get the same, not to the same level, but you get the same dopamine response, right? It's like people say, why do we like chocolate so much? Because it's delicious. That's why you like chocolate so much. It's not rocket science. So that's the reason why that argument doesn't necessarily hold, because you can eat something and you can still be satiated, but you can still be your brain can still be triggered by images, like other types of outside stimuli.
Well, right, but note, right, that my point in giving the example is simply to say when your brain, which would be your mind, right? And remember, the objective is mind or stance independent, right?
Yep.
When your brain, which on your view is also your mind, is completely non-functional.
Yes.
You still have to account for the bodily reaction that we call hunger, even though it's to a much more limited extent, because you're hardly dealing with any energy at all, right? I mean, you're just sitting there.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. Like, I'd have to talk to it. Like, I do have a couple of friends that are medical doctors, and I have to ask them, because I don't like if you are brain dead, then you're not getting a hunger response from the brain.
Exactly. That's exactly.
And you're also point. Right.
You are still internally having that reaction. Now you can't feel it, but the doctor knows if I don't replace those calories with new calories, this person will go from brain dead to medically dead, right?
Yeah, to bodily death. Yeah,
exactly.
That's a I guess I'm not sure. I guess I'd have to figure. I don't know if there is a physiological hunger response if you're brain dead. Yeah, I'm not a doctor. I can't tell you that.
Well, and to be fair, I could be wrong, but I am fairly certain, because I know that well, obviously I can't say I know people who were brain dead, because nobody has ever come out of brain death to the best of my knowledge. But I know of cases where people are brain dead. We'll put it that way. And there is still, there are things which are hooked up to them in order to replace calories lost.
So this is what happened to. So one of my sisters, she died in 2001. Like from this, like basically she went to she checked herself into the hospital at like 2:00 in the afternoon, complaining of flu-like symptoms. By 6:00, she was in a coma, like she was in a coma on life support, and she died a month later. And the cause of death was listed as septic shock. And so she didn't, like, once she was in a coma, right? She's not eating anymore, right? They put in a feeding tube, right? That's how they fed her, right? Now, she wasn't brain dead, obviously. But yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what happens as far as hunger response. Like, do you get a hunger response when you're brain dead? Intuitively, I think no, but I don't know.
And my understanding of it is, obviously it's not something you can experience because of the brain death, but it is the body. It's almost like a car that needs the gasoline. The body is still running at a small little idle, and so it still needs a replacement of gasoline every now and then. And my reason for bringing that up, though, is to say, there you have an example of something which is internally derived. It doesn't exist outside of the body, because it's by definition it's replacing calories lost in the body's functions, right?
Yeah.
But it's completely mind or stance independent, so much that the brain doesn't even have to be functional anymore in order for it to continue, right?
Yeah, and I guess the only way, and maybe this is the place where we wrap it up, because absent a professional medical opinion, we can't know the answer to that question as to whether or not the brain actually does produce a hunger response in brain death, right? So maybe we'll take the last couple minutes, and if there's anybody who had questions or something like that.
Yeah, let me see. I don't have any super chats, but that doesn't mean there's no questions. Let me see if there was any questions.
Why didn't you give him any super chats, people? Come on.
I did have a couple stickers from Doki. I appreciate Doki. Let's see. Looks like a big conversation about Calvinism. YouTube is so fun, right? You have conversations about stuff and people talk about things that are completely different. I guess it's not completely different, but being metaphorical, they are not really walking with God or God's healing hands, aren't they? Really touching that. TRWZ8. I've never seen you before, but thank you for being here. I don't know what you mean. All right. When I hear Christians say that they walk with God or hear the voice of God, that's not physical, it's immaterial. Question. Yeah, I think most of the time that's probably true. If you're talking to a Pentecostal or somebody who believes they've had some kind of experience, they might say that they have had a more tangible example of this. But I think usually when somebody says they hear the voice of God, what they're saying is that they feel as if God is speaking to them in a more mental fashion. It's not purely metaphorical, but I guess immaterial is probably a good word.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that kind of begs the question. It's like are thoughts physical?
Yeah, it kind of does, doesn't it?
And I don't know. I was absent the day they taught neuroscience, but it seems to me that if I had to guess, my professional medical opinion is, yeah, I think they are, because they're a product of the brain, and they don't exist outside of our brain, to the best of our knowledge. And when someone tells me they heard the voice of God, and it's hard for me to muster a lot of charity in that, because in my head I'm just thinking like, well, you heard voices. So, and it's hard for me to be more charitable than that, just given my profession and stuff like that. But yeah, it's, I would never downplay a person's experience. I would always say, yes, I'm sure you had an experience. I don't know what that experience was. But I would never downplay that the individual had an experience.
Yeah. We do have another question here that just came in for you. By the way, Sandy, thank you very much for your super sticker. I appreciate that. NZ dollars. That is New Zealand, isn't it? I had no idea you were from New Zealand. Thank you anyways. Appreciate that. Peter has asked, how does Michael tell right from wrong? And if it is subjective, why is his subjective opinion of such value that he thinks it needs to be expressed to many people?
That's an interesting question. So yes, it is my contention that morality is a social construct, but there has to be buy-in, right? So, and again, Peter, I'm assuming that you're a believer, a Christian. So we'll diverge almost right away, right? So from my perspective, humans are animals. We evolved through a laborious process over billions of years. And when we started to coalesce into groups, we had to start to learn how to work together. And this is where, mostly through empathy and things like this is where morality as a social construct came from. And there has to be buy-in. There has to be buy-in now too, right? Like if all the power went out, like if the lights went out and there's everything else like that, and we were thrust back into primitive living, for lack of a better term. What I mean when I say that have to be buy-in is I would have to give a damn about you, and you would have to give a damn about me in order to move forward in a productive way. So, do I think it needs to be expressed? Well, I think my opinion is valuable, if that's what you mean by being expressed to many people. But I certainly don't think that I have like the magic bullet solution. Most of the things that I'm sharing tonight are things I've read other places. They're not even my original thoughts or ideas. I'm just sharing what I've heard from others, and for the most part agree with. Hopefully that answers your question, but I do believe it's subjective.
Yeah, and if I can chime in here a little bit, I'd say actually two things. One point as a brief amount of charity to your position, which I will ultimately be disagreeing with vehemently, but I guess vehement is implying aggression, but you know what I mean. I do think there is something, if everything is subjective, there is at least something to whether or not things have a certain level of functionality to them. So, like, as an example, one could have the opinion that wheat tastes better than rice, and that would be subjective. But it could also be true that wheat is easier in your given climate to grow, and therefore it would be more functional for us to grow wheat than rice, right? And there's a kind of benefit to society there. I guess in a way that's an objective fact, though, that wheat is easier to grow in that given climate or all that kind of stuff. But what is subjective is whether or not it's better, right? So there is something to be said about whether or not things are functional. And that can even still be subjective because like a monarchy will be more functional in a certain country than a republic will. Or a dictatorship at certain eras in time is more functional than a democracy, which is a very sad thing, I think. But I think we have plenty of examples in history where that turned out to be true. But that's not necessary. So you're not making a claim about whether or not something's objectively true as much as you're making a claim about whether or not things are functional. With that being said, I don't think anything is truly right or wrong if it's subjective, kind of like I said with the dilemmas earlier. In my opinion, the whole reason a dilemma even functions, and not just the dilemma that we gave, but any dilemma, if each option doesn't have an objective value, in my opinion, there is truly no dilemma. It's just all a matter of what is more expedient or appropriate in your own mind. But it seems to me like, because, a dilemma is typically defined as something with two bad options or two undesirable options. It seems to me like in order for it to truly function as a dilemma in the first place, there must be a level of value to each. Do I want $5? This isn't a true dilemma because each option is kind of good. Do I want $5 worth of fries or $5 worth of undergarments? I guess $5 worth of undergarments isn't even much, but the point there just being that there's value in if there's value in, let me say, each option, then you have a true dilemma on your hand. But if there's no value, then it's just a matter of do I want more? Do I want underwear or do I want fries? And at that point, it's just whatever I feel like. So I do think that is so. To the latter part of your question, Peter, I do think there is value in expressing what you believe, even if things aren't subjective. But you can't tell anybody they're truly right or wrong, in my opinion, if it's subjective. You can just say, I think this might be more beneficial for all of us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. I think it's usually, like it should be noted that the first thing you talked about, wheat versus some other crop would be amoral, right? That wouldn't be a moral question at all. Right. And I think you're right in that, a dilemma is usually two things, neither one of, like, the trolley problem, right? Right. Do you throw the switch, one person or five people? Like both of those suck. Like they both suck. So, just, which one sucks less. So yeah, I understand where you're coming from there, but again, I think what I would go back to is that, yes, there has to be buy-in, right? And that's how, that's how societies function now. right? Is, groups of people coming together and coming to these social conventions, just like language, right? Language is a social convention too.
Yeah, and there's another point here. This isn't a question, but I did want to acknowledge it. Kevin asks, said, the example that was given with the man that had a railroad spike go through his head, it completely changed or altered his personality. Why is that? That is a great question. Me and Chris Date had a long conversation about that because he's a physicalist and I'm a dualist. But look it up. It is Phineas Gage. And they referred to him as no longer Phineas because he managed some unbelievable way to live through a railroad spike being driven through his skull and straight through his brain.
Didn't it go like up in here and out through there?
Yeah.
Like it was something crazy. Yeah.
Exactly. The fact that he lived is, I mean, obviously, I'm using the word miracle colloquially here, but it is a miracle. It's like, well, my goodness, how is that even possible?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
But yeah, he did. His personality and temperament actually changed. And I don't remember. There are some sources that say that they ended up getting closer to the way they were beforehand over time. But look it up. It's a very interesting thing. And it's very important to the question of whether or not physicalism or dualism are true, which for those who don't know, dualism says that human beings are made up of more than just the physical. And physicalism says that that's not true and that dualists are high. But I'm just kidding. But,
yeah, like, I mean, like for me, I'm very much, I think break it down to the lowest common denominator. It's all physical stuff. When I die, everything that I am will cease to be. And yeah, there'll be no more. Yeah, I'm not a dualist in that sense.
Yeah, and so yeah, check that out. And with that being said, I think that we're going to go ahead and get out of here. So actually, one last question. Peter asks, are the laws of logic conventional in Michael's worldview? Are the laws of logic conventional in your worldview?
So if you look up in the SEP under laws of logic, they are, I guess it depends how you're defining conventional. They are descriptive, right? So the laws, at least from my perspective, the laws of logic, quote unquote, don't exist. If you look it up in the SEP and it talks about logic, it says logic is a formal language invented by people, right? So it's again something we made up, right? And it happens to be descriptive of the world that we experience, right? Like you will, I guess it also depends on which laws of logic you're talking about, right? Because if you're talking about the standard laws, right, identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle, those are descriptive of the world. Like something is always what it is, and it's never not what it's not, and it's never what it is and what it isn't in the same way and in the same place, right? Those are descriptive of the universe that we experience. But Lawrence Krauss in one of his books talked about how all those things start to break down when you get down to the quantum level, and there are bits of physics where the standard laws of logic don't apply. So I hope that answers your question.
And I don't know hardly anything about quantum physics, so I can't comment.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah.
But
yeah, me neither. That's just my side hobby, quantum physics. That's just something I do in my spare time. Said nobody ever.
Right. But I will say that, just short, on my view, logic and morality occupy the same position, which is that they ultimately derive from something internal about God, and therefore are objective in so much as that they derive from not from the mind of, but from the nature of an ultimately unchanging and eternal being. Whether or not a knowledge of quantum physics would cause me to change that, I guess I can't really say. But anyways, that would just be the sort of short answer to that. With that being said, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we get out of here, as far as like final words, final thoughts?
No, I'd say I'm incredibly disappointed that nobody gave you any super chat love. I'm looking at the audience now. Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 and then encourage more of that love to come your way. No, I don't think so. If anybody's interested, we do a little bitty podcast called The Canadian Atheist. My dear friend Dean and I, to which CJ has been a guest before, and we like to have chats with people who agree with us and disagree with us. So if CJ will be so kind, he'll put a link to that in the description box for this. There's also, I'll throw my email address into the private chat here. Well, actually, you know what I'll do? I'll do what I'll never do. I can't do join here. CJ, I'm going to put my email in here into the private chat. If you wouldn't mind just sharing it. And anyone who wants to chat with us, I guess I need to spell it right though, right? Oh, geez, I'm tired. Send us an email. Love to have a chat with you. And about the only thing that I can say, and I guess CJ will be a witness to this, is anyone that comes on the podcast, we always give you at least half the time to talk, and there's no railroading, there's no muting. I don't edit conversations, nothing like that. You don't have to worry about that. But if you want to come and have a chat, feel free.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and drop the email there in the live chat for those who are interested. And if you're watching this after the fact, the links will be provided to Michael's content. I imagine you'll probably say again.
I'm just going to put the website.
Absolutely.
Oh, hang on.
And I imagine you'll probably be using this for the podcast, yes?
I will steal your content for an episode of ours. Yes, I will. I will cheat. I will cheat an episode out of this.
I actually, just briefly, when's the last time you had a podcast episode? I feel like I haven't seen one in a long time.
It's been a few weeks, actually. The next scheduled one is October 8th for Dean to be back in studio. He's been super busy to do a little bit of kind of like news and commentary stuff. Upcoming episodes include, we're having Dr. Daryl Ray back on the podcast to talk about religious trauma. And what else? That's all that's on the schedule so far.
All right.
But like I said, anyone that's listening to this or that will see it in the future, feel free to shoot us an email. And if you want to come on and have a chat, we love talking to people we disagree with.
Absolutely. And like I said, if you're watching this after the fact, there will be a link to that. And those of you who are here now, there's a link currently in the live chat. So if you want to check that out, you certainly can. So I'll go ahead and end by saying, if you guys liked the content we had here, please remember to like and share this video and consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so yet. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live or that we just post any sort of pre-recorded content. Certainly appreciate that. I did see a couple people in the live chat giving both positive and negative critiques of both me and Michael. So if you wanted to lay your thoughts out about things we said here, whether it was because you thought I made an error or Michael made an error or I had said something that was edifying or Michael said something that was edifying, please do leave those respectfully, of course, in the comment section down below. Provided that people are operating in good faith, I will definitely be sure to interact with you guys. And even if I don't think you're operating in good faith, I'll at least test the waters to see whether or not I'm right. Because sometimes I think that, and it turns out you actually are operating in good faith, and that's my own fault.
You know, the other thing we could do is, if you wanted, like if there are people who feel strongly about that thing, is whatever it is they're going to share. Like I said, I never look at the comments. But CG, if you're up for it, and there are people that, in your determination, are operating in good faith, then set up a panel discussion, and we'll have you, me, and a couple of other people, and we'll chat about stuff. Why not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'd be a great idea. So yeah, there you go, guys. A little bit of incentive for you to tell us where you thought either of us were doing good or bad. Yeah, also, if you guys are interested in contributing to anything here, all that. Patreons and super chats and whatnot. Appreciate you guys. Yeah, I mean, there's really, mostly, if you want channel housekeeping, go to the beginning. I laid all that stuff out, but as for now, I actually took 55 more minutes than I was allotted, so we're gonna go ahead and get out of here. But thank you guys very much. And if the Lord wills and tarries, we will be seeing you here soon. And I'll probably be posting my most recent debate with Standing here as my next content. But nevertheless, appreciate y'all. We're gonna go ahead and get out of here.
Cheers, everybody.